Okay, welcome everyone to this very special event, which is really a combination of a discussion around Palestinian rights at a very crucial moment in Palestinian history, and also the launch of a very special book by Professor Lynn Welshman, which details the history of Al-Haq, which is the first Palestinian human rights organization. This event is co-hosted by the Center of Palestine Study, which at SOAS, which I chair. I'm Dina Mata, and I'm the chair of Center of Palestine Studies. You have all the details on the website. It's also co-hosted by Professor Bishara Dubmani's Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University, and of course, and not least by the School of Law at SOAS, which is chaired by Scott Newton, who's going to be in the discussion. I don't want to talk much about what the discussion is going to be about, but what we're going to do here, I'll just tell you about the way we're going to manage this forum, is that each of the panelists, we have 5 panelists who will be talking, we have 6 panelists who will be talking about issues related to human rights, Palestinian rights, the law, struggle, and resistance, and all kind of speaking to and with Lynn's book from different perspectives. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion, I hope. I'm going to give each speaker about 10 minutes, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. I introduce each speaker as we get to them. And I encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A questions kind of icon at the bottom of Zoom, and also for those people who are joining us on Facebook to put their questions in the chat. And looking forward to this discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to call on Scott Newton to give the first intervention here. And Scott is the head of the School of Law. He is the chair of the SOAS Center of Contemporary Central Asia and Caucasus. His research interests encompass post-Soviet, post-colonial Eurasian legal geographies, post-colonial regulatory and institutional frameworks. And he also works on critical constitutionalism and the allied globalization projects of human rights, rule of law, conflict resolution, and global governance. If I missed anything, Scott, I'm sure you can put that in the discussion, but welcome.
That's more than enough, Tina.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome from an unusually warm and sunny London. It's a particular pleasure today for me. That's a professional pleasure, a personal pleasure, and a political pleasure, all rolled up in one, to welcome everyone for an especially auspicious book launch and discussion. The focus of the discussion, as Dean has said, will be appropriately enough on the book and its themes, on Palestine itself, the land, its people, and the role of al-Haq and law in affirming the inseparability of the one from the other and contesting the multiple modes and ruses of attempted separation. I want to focus briefly on the author and her relation to the book and her act of writing it, an act that is perfectly emblematic of Lynn's signature passion and courage and damned persistence, with all of which I have now been acquainted for more than 2 decades. When I first fetched up here at SOAS in 1999, Lynn was one of the very most welcoming colleagues, and the impression she made on me then has only deepened with time, and my admiration and respect have only grown since. Lynn is the very best of SOAS, equal parts scholar and activist, student of change, and agent of change, critic of law, and wielder of law. She earned her scholarly credentials at SOAS as a PhD student, and she has burnished them ever brighter across the intervening years as a SOAS scholar. Whilst the struggle for rights and justice in Palestine has been understandably her spiritual and intellectual lodestar, she has been pulled in other directions by her fundamental commitment to human rights as well, as far as Rwanda and Haiti. And that commitment she has made manifest in all sorts of ways here at SOAS, from her Islamic family law articles and books, her honor crimes project, to her amazing human rights clinic, which is one of the very luckiest tickets our grad students can draw. So the work we have come here today to herald and to honor is maktub, a writing down of epical events and extraordinary people and compelling ideas and novel practices, but it's also maktub in the figurative sense, i.e. ordained, destined. So Lynn's writing down of the story of Al-Haq, which is an amazing story, her act of writing was itself written, maktub. Lynn was made to write this book, and no one but she could have done it as witness, as participant, as chronicler, as analyst. The book itself is a meticulous, profoundly informed, and profoundly humane account, a kind of organizational biography of Al-Haq, or if you will permit, as I first said to Lynn some weeks back, a haqiography. It's as full of anecdote and incident as it is of argument and analysis. It's just studded with gems. The story of Raja's little pamphlet, the West Bank and the Rule of Law, for instance, or the saga of the Enforcement Project and the incorporation of IHL in the work of Al-Haq in the wake of the First Intifada. Each of these episodes is as rich in drama and human interest as it is in scholarly critique. It's a testament to sumud of different sorts. The sumud of lawyers is a distinctive kind, manifest in a particular professional kind of diligence and detail and dedication. And the sumud of human rights lawyers in the context of occupation, in the teeth of determined, defiant, and diabolically clever adversaries and authorities is even more so. And when you join this kind of professional sumud to the kind of ethical, political, and cultural sumud that Palestinians have so admirably cultivated for these many decades, what you get is something categorically distinct, which Al-Haq has made its trademark, an altogether singular patience, tenacity, and persistence over the longue durée. And as long as I'm talking about the varieties of sumud, the sumud of Lynn Welshman deserves special mention and special honor. Because when you compound the sumud of lawyers and the sumud of human rights lawyers in particular, with the sumud of Palestinians, and then the sumud of Lynn Welshman as rigorous scholar historian, well, then you have something overpowering, something that simply was meant to be something maktub. Congratulations, Lynn. And congratulations, Raja. And congratulations, Shaban.
Thank you, Scott. That was pretty impressive, and it does tell us about Lynn and her work and her tenacity. I think it does deserve mention. I'm going to call Bishara now, and I forgot to say in the introduction that Bishara played a big role in this because he is the editor of the book series that published that kind of published this book as part of the new series on new directions of Palestine studies. And so that is a double kind of accolade, or that you can have, Bishara, before I introduce you. Bishara is the inaugural Mahmoud Darwish Professor of Palestinian Studies, the first chair of its kind dedicated to this field of study at Brown University in the US. He's the founding director of Brown's Center for Middle East Studies and founder of New Directions for Palestinian Studies, a CMES initiative since 2012. His research focuses on groups, places, and time periods marginalized by mainstream scholarship on the early modern and modern Middle East, with a focus on the social, economic, and legal history of the Eastern Mediterranean. He is the editor of the book series on Palestinian Studies, published by the University of California Press, and co-editor of the Jerusalem Quarterly, among many other kind of hats that he wears, and different hats that he wears at different times. I had the pleasure of meeting you at Mesa, and also of reading your work, and particularly your history books, his historiographies. If I don't mention it properly, it's being Palestinian. You are allowed to make mistakes in pronunciation. But anyway, Bishara, welcome. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dina. I'm honored to be here. I also want to thank Barbara Oberketter at the Brown side, who helped to organize this, and of course, Nadia Al-Ali, who is familiar to most of you, who is now the director of Middle East Studies at Brown University. I met Lynn in the early 80s in Batn al-Hawa, I think it was, where she lived in Ramallah. And I'm so glad that our paths have crossed over the years, and especially now this book, in many ways, had its genesis back in those days of the First Intifada. I'm sorry, that preceded the First Intifada by almost a decade. So I think book launches are wonderful. They're poignant events because often what brings us to write books are very painful and sometimes insurmountable challenges that we're facing. And we decide to sort of contribute. And that leads us to write the books that we do, and especially in the case of Lynn here, especially appropriate. But they're also wonderful events to celebrate the fact that this is often a collective effort. And what Lynn has done beyond writing the book is give expression or articulate a larger family and network that has developed over the years. And being part of that family and network is really important, considering the challenges that lie ahead. So thank you, Lynn, for bringing us together and for writing this book. I just want to say two quick words about where I think this book fits in the larger field of Palestinian studies, and what are some of the political intellectual stakes that led us to publish it in the New Directions in Palestinian Studies book series that Dina mentioned. And I want to emphasize by way of opening this point, that is called Palestinian Studies, not Palestine Studies. And that's very important, I think, because it opens up a much larger intellectual and political space for reinventing the political vocabulary that we've inherited and that we must change. So in a 1995 interview, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish said, quote, "Palestinian poetry has, for less than a decade, become conscious of the necessity of humanizing its themes and passing from Palestine as a topic or an object to Palestinian as subject." I think this ontological shift in poetry also holds true for shifts in the political imagination, in institution building, and in knowledge production. Law in the Service of Man, later known as Al-Haq, which was established in 1979 as the first Palestinian human rights organization, is a prime example. The change in focus from Palestine to Palestinian is evident in the name itself, man. Writ large, of course, but I should say heteronormative nevertheless. Man became the subject on three levels: the individual, the collective, that is to say the Palestinians as a political community, and the human as universal citizens with inalienable rights. Now, Al-Haq's founders dared to imagine or reimagine politics by initially taking a quote unquote non-political stance in defense of quote unquote the rule of law. This in itself is not highly unusual until one is reminded that they did so in the context of a dominant nationalist political culture that saw itself as leading the struggle against a settler colonial project which steals Palestinian lands and builds Israeli Jewish colonies while incarcerating Palestinians and brutally repressing them. And this is, of course, an ongoing struggle. As the first Palestinian organization of its kind, and one of the earliest in the Middle East and the world, Al-Haq had an outsized influence locally, regionally, and internationally in terms of its innovative forms of self-governance and methods of data collection, seasoned by working under very difficult long-term conditions of foreign military rule. In his reports and published self-reflections, Al-Haq produced insightful forms of knowledge about the external pressures on and internal contradictions of the Palestinian condition. The rise and inevitable crises experienced by Al-Haq, especially after the 1993 Oslo Accords, have profound lessons to teach all of us about the forms of political mobilization that are opened and foreclosed by human rights frameworks, and about how the Palestinian experience enriches our understanding of larger global trends and the struggle for justice, equality, and freedom. So what Lynn has done is to look at the world through the eyes of Palestinian legal activists. Her book contributes to New Directions in Palestinian Studies book series, because among other things, the book series seeks to rigorous works of scholarship that center the Palestinian experience, introduce new narratives and actors, and utilize locally generated vernacular sources. So NDPS values, in many ways, justice-centered academic works that at the same time do not shy away from critical analysis of internal problems and contradictions. And one of the most important dimensions of Lynn's book is her judicious and honest account of the conflicts, political, personal, institutional, ideological, which rocked al-Haq, especially after the tragedy of the Oslo Accords and the failures of the Palestinian Authority started to come into full view. In hindsight, these conflicts were inevitable, considering the historical moment of al-Haq's formation, which straddled third-worldist anti-colonial worldviews, which might we call the Bandung moment of the 50s and the 60s, that were concerned with social, economic, decolonization, or development, as they called it. That's on the one hand, but coming down the horizons on the other was a different moment. That is the moment of a universalist liberal conceptual vocabulary concerned with international law and human rights, often in reaction to the fact that these decolonizing projects, especially in the Nasser era, sought to make major structural changes but at the expense of human rights and personal freedoms. So Welshman's book, in many ways, offers a prehistory of human rights work that globalizes the Palestinian experience. I want to thank Lynn really for one more thing, and that is the integrity that one feels in the book itself, in every line, in every phrase, in every word. They don't make them like this anymore, Lynn. And I really, really appreciate the fact that it was you who put together this overview of a fight, a struggle, an institution, and a politics that has changed over the years and that has a lot to teach us. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Oh,
Bishara.
by the way, I'm sorry, I forgot to say the most important thing, which is Raja Shahadi and Penny Johnson. We were talking one day and they said, you know, Lynn is doing this book, it's done, she's going with another publisher, maybe you want to take a look at it and talk to her. And of course, within 24 hours, I was able to poach that book away from the other publisher. And thank you, Lynn, for allowing that to happen. And thank you, Raja and Penny, for letting me know.
Thank you, Bishara. And we come now to Sharwan, who played a major role in this book and also in al-Haq. Sharwan is the Palestinian, probably the Palestinian subject that Bishara was talking about, you know, kind of thinking of Palestinians and what they do as subjects of different experiences and having lived through different experiences. But Sharwan Jabari is a Palestinian human rights defender who has been the general director of al-Haq since 2006, after first joining it in 1987 as a field worker. He has served as a commissioner for the IJC, member for the Human Rights Watch Middle East Advisory Board, been elected as vice president and then president of the International Federation of Human Rights Leagues, and is the recipient of many distinguished awards for his human rights work, the first being the Reebok Human Rights Awards for Young Human Rights Defenders in 1990. His reflections and interventions have been widely published, including in Foreign Policy, Open Democracy, and The Independent. So, Sharwan, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to hearing of your intervention here and your work, of course.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for the Center for Palestine Studies in Suez. Let me first thank you all for organizing this special event and congratulate my dear friend Lynn Welshman for the extraordinary effort she has paid to write this book that is dedicated to Al-Haq, the first human rights organization in the Middle East. When we add North Africa, we will become part of the first organizations. But in Middle East, we are the first human rights organization. Today, it's honors me, to be with you, to participate and celebrate the launching of this very important book that is written by the committed and dedicated colleague and human rights defenders who succeeded in describing the process of the organization in an objective and professional manner. This book means a lot to me and to all of us. We have been waiting for it for a time, and today it's between our hands. When speaking about Lynn and Al-Haq, my testimony might be invalid, as I am the general director of the organization. However, I will try to be as objective as possible before I share with you some lessons we have learned throughout the long building process of Al-Haq. I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to the founders of Al-Haq, especially Mr. Raja Shahada, who was the first person to stand behind the establishment of the organization. Also, I would like to thank all early staff of the organization, as well as its present and previous staff, and volunteers and board and general assembly members who have given a lot to the organization through their work and their strong position. Here I mentioned with gratitude my dear colleague, Emma Playfair. Too many people have worked for Al-Haq. If we look at the long process of the organization, we will see that it has passed through different but connected phases and stations. Persons we have worked during this period have made us use of the experience of the people who preceded them in a creative manner. The experiences are not necessarily positive in their entirety, but people learned from all of these experiences to build an organization that keeps developing and growing like a living creature. This has made the name of Al-Haq in the forefront, irrespective of the persons who work for it. One of the things that has contributed to the success of the organization in its impartiality, professionality, and non-partisan nature. Al-Haq does not belong to any political party. It does its work based on the internationally recognized human rights values and the principles in which it deeply believes. The organization tends to have people from the generations working for it. You will always see old, middle-aged, and young people in the organization. This has protected the organization from aging and being traditional in its approach, and opened wide the door for innovation and the creativity at various levels. When Al-Haq started to use the colonialism and apartheid frameworks to describe the case in Palestine many years ago, some believed that we should be more careful in what we say and write. Today, there is a consensus among the human rights community at the international level that our perspective is correct and that what is happening in Palestine is settler colonial regime and the practices and apartheid. Al-Haq is functioning in a very complex context and environment where international law has lost much of its value due to the absence of political will to hold perpetrators of international crimes accountable. This makes our mission even more complex, as we need to double our effort to convince people, especially the young generations, of the visibility of the system that has failed so far in bringing justice to them and enable them to enjoy their individual and collective rights. I don't want to go through the first Intifada and what we had at that time, but I would like, in spite of all of this, Al-Haq has maintained its respected status among people because of its professionality, transparency, and impartiality. Lynn's book focuses on a phase of Al-Haq's life when half of the one third of the staff were internationals. Al-Haq has always welcomed and encouraged internationals to contribute to the work of the organization and learn from its experience. Today, and as a result of the Israeli policies and harassment, internationals can join Al-Haq easily. Only 3 staff members are internationals these days, and all of them, they are outside of the country. They are working online. The organization has been the subject of orchestrated Israeli campaign to silence its voice through different means, including by defamation and drying of financial resources. However, I assure you that Al-Haq will continue to do the work it believes in, and that Israeli oppression and campaigns will not prevent us from doing our work. What makes us optimistic is the hope in the new generations that have started to make change at the international level. Therefore, I would suggest that the present book be the first book and the preparations start for the second book, as there are many things that need to be said and documented about the process of Al-Haq's life. Lens has to be ready for that. Finally, let me say again, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Bishara. Thank you, Dina. And thanks to you all. We will never give up hope that justice will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharwan, and we'll probably have loads of questions for you. So we come to Raja. Nice to see you again, Raja.
Nice to see you.
Palestinian lawyer and writer who lives in Ramallah, very well known, obviously. He co-founded Al-Haq in 1979 and shared the leadership of the organization until the early 1990s. He was lead author of Al-Haq's first groundbreaking publication, The West Bank and the Rule of Law, in 1980, and published significant works on international law, the Israeli occupation, and Palestinian rights. He was legal advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington talks that followed the first Intifada. He is also the author of highly acclaimed memoirs and diaries, and has contributed reflections to the London Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Guardian, among others. His book, Palestinian Walks, won the Orwell Prize for Political Writing in 2008, and it's just a wonderful read, which really takes you to the land as it should. So thank you for that, Raja, but looking forward to your intervention today.
Thank you, Dina. I want to thank all the other speakers, but I want to reserve my main thanks for Lynn for her outstanding scholarship and the meticulous care in which she narrated Al-Haq's story truthfully, critically, and thoroughly. Her book tells the story of how a fledgling pioneering organization managed to be established and survive in one of the most complicated and critical places in the world in which to work on promoting and protecting human rights. It's a story that Lynn manages to tell with such passion and vividness that it makes for exciting reading. I would like to point out that Al-Haq's uniqueness among Palestinian public institutions is that all communications were in writing, documented and archived. And this made it possible for Lynn to carry out this comprehensive study of the organization. In this short talk, I will try and provide a selective history of the use of law as an instrument of struggle and as a means of resistance against Israeli aggression. Everything I shall allude to here is discussed at length in Lynn's excellent and exhaustive work. In fact, reading Lynn's work reminded me of so much of that history that I had forgotten. Al-Haq's establishment came at a propitious time. It was 12 years after the start of the Israeli occupation. There was then a total absence of legal challenge to the occupation. There were also no human rights organizations in the occupied territory. What made matters worse was that shortly after the Israeli occupation on 5 June 1967, the entire judiciary and lawyers in the West Bank decided to go on strike, which incidentally came to be the longest lawyer strike in history, lasting for over 3 decades. The strike meant that the Palestinian lawyers abandoned the legal struggle against the occupation. The first obstacle faced by the founders of the new project of establishing this first human rights organization was how to register. The occupation had taken over the power to register NGOs. I still remember the heated arguments we had with veteran lawyers who were adamant that the company's law, the local company's law, does not allow the registration of not-for-profit companies. But we held our ground and managed to get the organization registered as a company. This marked our first success and first creative use of the law. All this is described at length in Lynn's excellent book. One of the good fortunes of Al-Haq is that the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva was headed by a progressive, courageous man, Neil McDermott, who at that early time, the end of the 70s, was the only leader of a human rights organization willing to support a Palestinian organization like Al-Haq, critical of Israel. For this support, he had to fight constant battles with his board, who were persistently trying to hold him back. Neil was a great mentor who guided us in our work, and Al-Haq owes him a lot. He was willing to stand by us publicly, which at the time was no mean feat. He not only agreed to allow the affiliation of Al-Haq with the ICJ, but also co-published the organization's first publication, The West Bank and the Rule of Law. This was a modest book, and here it is, if you can see it. It's a modest book, but at that time, one of great significance. It shed light on how Israel was using secret legislation to bring about changes in the law of the occupied territories. This is what Neil wrote in the preface to the book. There have been isolated cases, as in Chile, where 1 or 2 decrees of military government have been treated as secret documents and not published. However, this is the first case to come to the attention of the International Commission of Jurists, where the entire legislation of a territory is not published in an official gazette available to the general public, unquote. The small publication put Al-Haq, which was then LSM, Law in the Service of Man, on the map and drew a blueprint of its future work, which consisted of adding flesh to the bones, to the structure described in the book through more detailed studies on specific topics. Thus more was done on the land expropriations, settlements, land use planning, and settler violence, among other subjects. The reluctance of the major Western human rights organizations to speak out made our work at Al-Haq all the more important and risky. Thus, Al-Haq, for example, was the first to call what was taking place in Israeli prisons torture, when at the time, Amnesty International, for example, only described it as mistreatment. Al-Haq was taking risks by daring to call a spade a spade. The great disappointment to all of us at Al-Haq came a decade later, when Al-Haq's counsel was not sought neither in the drafting of the terms of reference of the negotiations between Israel and the PLO, nor later in drafting what emerged as the Oslo Accords of 1993-95. The resulting accord consolidated rather than did away with these military orders that Al-Haq had analyzed in its various publications. And in this way, keeping it all in place, all the legal settlements and the means at Israel's disposal to create new ones. At present, international standing and increased means available to the organization enables it to manage larger challenges than has been the case in the past. Most important of these is in helping the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court at The Hague to prepare the case against Israel for war crimes. And perhaps Shawan, the present director, can tell us more about what is happening in this regard. Several decades after its establishment, the organization has much work to do. The future is likely to be of more settler violence and aggression, whether on Al-Aqsa or on the Palestinian communities in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. My own great apprehension, which I've already written about, is of an attempted mass expulsion of Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank by armed settlers strategically situated, as they are, on high grounds around most Palestinian cities and villages. They are driven by an ideology that Jerusalem and the West Bank are theirs alone, holy lands given to them by the Almighty. Should such ethnic cleansing take place, Al-Haq would be there to ring the alarm bell and hopefully avert the surreptitious attempt by these criminal violent settlers to perpetrate a repeat performance of the 1948 Nakba. Let us hope it doesn't come to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. That raises a lot of questions around the present and what is happening right now. And now Lisa. Lisa Hajjar is a sociologist who focuses on law and conflict, human rights, political violence, and contemporary international affairs. Her work is interdisciplinary and contributes to multiple fields in the social sciences and humanities, including Middle East studies, American studies, law and society. Her current research focuses primarily on the US war on terror, particularly around the issues of torture, targeted killing, and Guantanamo. She also focuses on human rights in the Arab world. Her journalistic writings have been published in The Nation, Al Jazeera English, Middle East Report, and Jadaliyya. But there's so much more to Lisa that I don't have time to talk about now. But I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be a part of this very august group. And by the way, somebody just posted my Twitter handle. I only use Twitter when I'm in Guantanamo, but you can still follow me. So I would call my comments today, or title them, The World That Al-Haq Made. As I was reading Lynn Welshman's rich and unsparing history of Al-Haq, I was struck by a line on page 149, which begins, quote, back in the early 80s when jihadists still believed in the power of law. And it continues. This line, embedded in the middle of the book, encapsulates one of the core paradoxes of this organization, specifically legal work on behalf of Palestinians' rights generally and human rights activism globally. If the criteria for judging the value of human rights work was whether it stopped or even reduced Israeli human rights violations and deterred Israeli war crimes, excuse me, then empirical reality would demand a finding that the law did not work. It did not set Palestinians free, did not protect them, did not punish those who harmed, killed, or oppressed them. Lori Allen has written a whole book about disappointment and dashed hopes, which she aptly titled The Rise and Fall of Human Rights, Cynicism and Politics in Occupied Palestine. Such skepticism about the efficacy of law and human rights activism is not unique to Palestine, and Lynn writes about it sort of brilliantly and critically. It can be found almost everywhere lawyers try to enforce the law to protect the rights of discriminated and disenfranchised groups against recalcitrant and illiberal states. Stuart Scheingold, in his seminal book, The Politics of Rights, characterizes the investment of time and hope in litigation and other law-based strategies as, quote, the myth of rights. So Scheingold writes, the myth of rights is premised on a direct linking of litigation, rights, and remedies with social change, which he characterizes as naive in extremis. Scheingold's point is that law can vindicate rights only when and if there is political support for the goals of legal work. So I'm going to explain why I regard Scheingold's contention that politics should come first as naive and extremist, and why the global history of al-Haq that Lynn Welshman's book documents supports this critique. But first, let's think about the paradoxical significance of that phrase I mentioned above, still believed. Shahade and other members of the triumvirate, that's Jonathan Kutab and Charles Shammas, who formed al-Haq, certainly believed in the power of law when they started, as evidenced by the fact that they named their organization Law in the Service of Man, and they envisioned their work as doing law, not politics. So just to illuminate something, there's a passage on page 55 in which Welshman is writing about a 1980 entry in Reza Shahade's journal. And the topic is the decision back in 1980 by Palestinian lawyers to mount a legal challenge to the deportation of 2 West Bank mayors before the Israeli High Court. So quoting Welshman, Shahade's father Aziz was preparing one affidavit to the High Court on the 4th Geneva Convention's prohibition of deportation and another on the illegality of deportation under the Jordanian constitution and the status of the British issued defense emergency regulations of 1945, under which the orders had been made. Shahade reported wild hope amongst many and wrote that even the political diehards who say we should never appeal to or recognize any Israeli institution are excited. At the end of his journal, Shahade records hopes crushed when the High Court declined to recommend the repeal of the deportation orders. End quote. So hopes crushed by the loss of a court case is the quintessential manifestation of thinking like a lawyer. But there's an analytical alternative that involves not thinking like a lawyer. Indeed, one of the great merits of Welshman's book is that she contextualizes the work of lawyers and the legalistic contributions of al-Haq without judging them as a lawyer would in terms of wins and losses. In terms of al-Haq's main goals, defending the rule of law, championing justice and rights for Palestinians, advocating legal accountability for law violators, and pursuing international protection against gross crimes, the record of losses and defeats was almost unbroken. But let's examine al-Haq's record, as Welshman does, through a global lens. Al-Haq changed the world, or to put it another way, we live in the world that al-Haq made. Al-Haq, along with the Gaza Center for Rights and Law, which was later renamed the Palestine Center for Human Rights, pioneered the use of international humanitarian law as a cudgel to expose, criticize, condemn, and most importantly, to explain to the world the illegalities and illegitimate nature of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. That work chipped away at Israel's false narrative that the state was ruling Palestinians legally and exercising legitimate prerogatives to confiscate Palestinian land, to settle Jewish citizens in the occupied territories, to rely on coercive interrogation techniques as a security imperative, and so on. Al-Haq set a course that many other human rights lawyers and activists have followed and adapted in their own contexts, judging a powerful state against the standards of law and stripping the state of a monopoly over the interpretation of law. Today, many human rights and justice activists the world over can speak authoritatively about IHL violations and the consequences that should result because of the examples set by Al-Haq. At the turn of the 21st century, Al-Haq and PCHR invested their monitoring and analyzing skill sets in the business of accountability through international criminal law enforcement. If we were to think about the results of these efforts like a lawyer, we could bemoan the fact that to date, no Israeli war criminals have been indicted in any court system. But contrary to the Scheingoldian admonition that law can't work without strong political support, this accountability work itself, despite the lack of wins, is altering global narratives about Israel and Palestine. And in that regard, legal activism is affecting the political terrain, albeit in ways whose outcomes are hard to predict. The US-based Center for Constitutional Rights, which has undertaken a number of projects and cases to defend Palestinian rights, has a slogan for this: success without victory. So Welshman's epilogue is a catalog of successes without victory. For example, she describes the unhappy fallout of the UN Goldstone Commission report as the impetus for Al-Haq and other Palestinian human rights organizations to activate more direct Palestinian access to the International Criminal Court. By the end of 2017, Al-Haq, PCHR, along with Al-Mazan and Al-Adamir, had submitted 5 substantive communications to the ICC prosecutor in The Hague, supporting allegations of particular war crimes and crimes against humanity, which could be attributed to specific high-level Israeli military and civilian officials. One of these, which focused on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, presented evidence of the crime of apartheid against Palestinians. As Welshman writes, quote, "It is in giving the lie to official Israeli self-images of justice and the rule of law as the basis of its governance, as well as holding the Palestinian authorities to account, that current Palestinian human rights work, albeit in a much more complex circumstances, most closely evokes the impetus that established Al-Haq in the late 1970s. So Al-Haq's work deserves some of the credit for the fact that Israeli apartheid now slips easily off the tongue and has become a focus for new generations of activists in support of Palestinian rights. Official Israeli hysteria over this framing is an example of success without victory. So to conclude my argument about a world that Al-Haq made, I would just draw your attention to a quote that Lynn cites from 2016 by Shawan Jabarin, and quoting, "Palestine in its legal and jurisprudential aspects is a test for the whole system of international law." And I heartily agree with that. Thank you, Lynn, for writing this book.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great, and raises many questions. And finally, we come to Lynn. To give her comments and her responses. Lynn Welshman is Professor of Law in the Middle East and North Africa at the SOAS School of Law and founder of the International Human Rights Clinic. She has published widely on areas including family law, Islamic law, women's rights, and human rights in the Arab world. She is a member of the Open Society Foundation's MENA Office Advisory Board and of the board of the Euro-Mediterranean Foundation for the Support of Human Rights Defenders. She worked with Al-Haq for different periods and in different capacities from the early 1980s and is the author of the book that we are launching today. Lynn, welcome and thank you.
Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. And I've got a video. Thank you, everybody. I sort of had to wait a bit to think what, well, first of all, thanks to everybody. Thank you, Dina, for supporting this and helping to organize it, and Aki for doing physicalities of it. Scott, thank you for your words. I didn't know you knew so much about me. It's a little worrying, but that's very nice. Thank you. Well, you thought so much. Thank you. Bishara for the publishing. It was wonderful. I was in Ramallah and I was at an Al-Haq 40th anniversary. Remember that Al-Haq asked me to write this book for its 30th anniversary. So I went back on the 40th, and the next day I got a call from Bishara in Nablus, who I met in Bat al-Hawar in 1984, whatever it was, saying, hey, you know, have you thought about, and it was very nice. And to be fair, Bishara, the other publisher would have been Dina, the IB Tourist, the Palestine Center at SOAS publisher, and she very generously with Adam agreed to that it should go with your press, with your new series, which is, I think, I am ethically, I think it was a wonderful opportunity for me to contribute to your goal of decolonizing knowledge production about the Palestinian situation. And I think it's really where the book belongs. And the fact that it's free to download to anybody across the world is exactly where academia needs to be and exactly where we need to be thinking about putting that knowledge out there. So I'm really very grateful that your center made that happen. Lisa, your work, as you will have seen, I hope, was seminal to many of my arguments. So I'm very, very proud that you agreed to join this. And we also met in the 80s in Ramallah. If you remember, Ramallah, that was number 8, yeah. And Raja, as a friend and a mentor, and one of the co-founders of Al-Haq with Jonathan Kateb and Charles Shamez. Raja, you've always been a model and an inspiration, and really rather daunting until one realizes that you don't mean to do that. And then when you realize you don't mean to be daunting, it sort of just becomes inspirational. I'm just saying it can be quite daunting because of the concentration you bring to thinking about things. And that's partly what I'm going to talk about in just 1 minute. Shawan, the next volume should be ready by Christmas, but I'm not going to guarantee delivery just at the moment until we've agreed what you wanted to cover, okay? And I won't tell you which Christmas, probably, for the moment. But thank you for inviting me to write it, and thank you for your friendship over the years, and thank you for not giving me as hard a time as you were entitled to do for the constant delays. It was a much harder book to write than I thought it would be. And Bishara, I appreciated your words at the start about how when you pick a project, it can sometimes bring things that you didn't expect it to bring, and it can be more difficult than you thought. So that's me making excuses. I already apologized in my 2013 professorial inaugural lecture for being late with the Al-Haq book, and that was 7 years ago now. So anyway, there you go, Shawan. Thank you for your friendship and for keeping up with it. And finally, I would have to say thank you to Al-Haq. The book dedication is to Al-Haq, particularly to everybody, former staffers, present staffers, well, future staffers, but they didn't talk to me, who talked to me about the book. It really, the book became a collective endeavor. I was, you know, I did have people contacting me when they heard it was being writing and so on, and it became, I felt like I was sort of, well, to a certain extent, of course, it's my responsibility for how I interpreted it, but I was a bit of a repository for a lot of these stories. And part of what I want to say about that is that some of the things we talked about, well, you talked about, Bishara, you alluded to some of the difficult times Al-Haq had, was, as a former staffer told me, precisely because Al-Haq meant so much and means so much to people. Because it meant so much and means so much is why those tensions happened, along with the political background, and why people kept wanting to talk about it, about particular episodes, particular times, and so on. And I think that's probably inevitable, but it's also indicative of one thing I wanted to talk about, the idea that the best work, well, certainly a lot of the best work in the world comes out of collective endeavor. It comes out of sitting around with a group of people who trust each other, who have an agreed on aim, not necessarily agreed on how to get there, but then, and in the case of Palestinian human rights groups, and I suppose, well, I'm sure human rights groups elsewhere, but what I learned from Al-Haq as soon as I went to Palestine was that when you're in the face of apparently insurmountable odds, insurmountable obstacles, and odds that you can't even start counting, it is absolutely imperative that you still come up with an idea. You have to have an idea about how you're going to meet those odds, how you're going to beat those odds. This is the thing about what Lisa was saying. And I think that idea of sparking off in a group worked very well, as I said in the book, with Al-Haq for many years. And I think it still does inspire the idea that if you can get a collective around a table and bang, as we know, bang your ideas around, it comes out with much more than the sum of your parts. And that's ultimately what Al-Haq was, and what I still think it is. Because now we see Al-Haq working much more closely with a wider range. Of course, there's more human rights organizations, and there's this groundbreaking work at the ICC, which has been a massively difficult struggle and a massively long haul. And again, that's about the persistence of saying, I will get up tomorrow and do it again, and we will sit together and have another idea, and we will do it again, is something, the courage of that is something that I learned for the first time when I went in 1982 and met Al-Haq in 1983, LSM as it was then, and has inspired me ever since. It's interesting what you said, Shawan, about there having been more non-Palestinian staffers there, because the ones also, many of them got in touch about this book. And I think for all of us non-Palestinian staffers who came, it was such a glowing time in our lives. It was so full of energy, momentum, and dynamism that I think it spurred people on and inspired us all in many, many ways. And I'm sorry that that other people can't. Non-Palestinian staffers, but I'm sure that Palestinian staffers are still getting that. And that's sort of the idea of being able to keep that. I suppose to me, what it was seeing human rights being done in the daily grind, day after day after day, just doing it, and also as Al-Haq management did and does, trying to do it in a participatory way, especially in the in the early years, in a way that implemented human rights between people. And we must remember that Al-Haq from the very beginning was also, Al-Sam from the beginning was trying to also look at human rights in Palestinian society. Its beginning was and it kept saying, that's the other thing, you know, there was always these reflections. So Al-Haq is really busy, LSM, 1986, everything's happening. And they keep publishing these long reflective points about who are we? Why are we doing, why are we doing this? It's almost like, why are you writing this? You know, because it's taking time. But all this was coming out of these meetings, general meetings that where people were knocking these and coming to an agreement, a consensus, building themselves through building the organization of what it means to do human rights under occupation. And that, of course, builds into discussions on, like you see the first 3 reports that Al-Haq did in the annual reports in the first Intifada. They were amazing gatherings of just amazing field work, and I'll talk about that in a minute, underlying analyses. And the analyses were talking about what areas of law can we use, what applies and what doesn't. And sort of, it's not a straightforward human rights report. It never was. It was always much more. It's extraordinary work. And, you know, things like the representation to state parties, you can see reflections of that from 1990 in the 10th emergency session from 2017 or 18, when using the same wording. It's very, very interesting. I mean, in some ways you could say, yes, it's a problem because it keeps coming back because it hasn't been done, but it means that having the idea of what might be useful and still coming back to it is another legacy that Al-Haq is still living. And the ICC work, I think, is testament to really, really massively hard work and to the thing that Al-Haq has done, which everybody pays testament to, which is the methodology of its documentation and evidence. It's 2 things. It's first of all, saying that everything had to be evidenced and how you collect evidence and how you work with your community and communities to collect the evidence. This is the field research, absolutely central to Al-Haq. And then, so at the beginning of the first Intifada, there's a bit of a spat because the Palestinian, the Jerusalem Palestinian Center was a bit cross because Al-Haq wouldn't say anything about what was going on in Gaza because at the time they didn't have field workers in Gaza, sort of a classic sort of, we can't say it because we haven't documented itself. I mean, they got over that when they had field workers in Gaza quite soon. But that idea of having evidence from the ground informing everything and also informing what Al-Haq looked at. So it wasn't a top-down, we should look at this, we should find evidence. It was anyway, and that you can see coming out of the reports. Very important, mapping not only the violation, but also that. And then having all that information and saying, so what do we do with it? So part of what you do with it is you do what's happening elsewhere in the world a bit, but getting another area of Palestinian voice directly involved was the database development. This is things people don't think about, but actually being involved in a growing idea of how do we document how do we retrieve the information. Al-Haq had a major input into saying how we're going to sort out a document retrieval system that serves our needs in the West Bank, in Gaza, or wherever. We're not going to accept a system that doesn't actually work for us. We're not doing it for research elsewhere. We're doing it for how we need to find our information. Absolutely stunning work. And one more thing I have to check as well is, of course, the library. I mean, who would think you start up a human rights organization and one of the first things you do is say, oh, we've got to have a library. Well, not everybody think you have to have a library, but this is the idea of having sources of building. And of course, the idea was it's a public library, so people could come, Palestinians could come from the community, school students, university students, you know, and learn about human rights law. It's an extraordinary thought to do it at that time. So, yeah, and Al-Haq, of course, now does training and methodology. It's involved in database development, all sorts of international levels. All these things which Al-Haq is continuing are things that come from ideas that no doubt we can ask Shahwan to talk for the next hour, actually talk about new ideas, Shahwan, you're having at Al-Haq now, and, you know, where those might go, because laying the basis of rigor, I mean, this is one of the things, of course, I learned Al-Haq and everybody learns Al-Haq. And the field researchers who would tell me about this would say the same thing. And Mu'in Rabbani, I recount this anecdote that he said, Mu'in Rabbani, who's now in the International Crisis Group and worked for Al-Haq in the early 1990s, first Intifada. And he said, you know, he's a very accomplished researcher now in his own right and so on. And he said, you know, I still, if I've published something, I go to bed and wake up in a sweat, but I think I've got a footnote wrong. And this is, he blames it entirely on Al-Haq, or credits it to Al-Haq, if you like. So that, and the field researchers that I talked to all talked about that being drilled into them, and how the coordinators of the fieldworks unit and how their work fed into development of what the organization was doing. These are things that are not the obvious part of the product, if you like, of a human rights organization, and they need to be, I think, foregrounded, especially now that Shawan, well, Al-Haq and PCHR and Al-Mizan and Al-Damir and are doing this work at the ICC, which requires a particular type of coordination, a particular type of evidence collection, and is particularly sensitive, as somebody has already said, for the Israeli authorities, who are extremely clearly unsettled by it, to say the least. So how LSM and Al-Haq have inserted the Palestinian voice directly, also by saying, we will have our say on what humanitarian means. We will try. There was a time in 1980, right at the beginning of the Intifada, they didn't mean it to be then, when they asked for help, knowing how to ask for help. So they get all these international lawyers and experts and academics to come to Jerusalem in the West Bank. And as it turned out, at the beginning of the first Intifada. And so these guys and women are there at the beginning and looking at what's going on. And when I was doing the research for this book, the people who were field researchers who were involved in helping them and in getting a read and bringing witnesses and testimonies and organizing, they were absolutely adamant that this was such a big collective endeavor. And again, it's one of these things that apparently, according to Emma Playfair, whose book, by the way, editing the papers from this conference, is a seminal collection for international humanitarian law coming out of this conference, which apparently started by a general meeting where everybody's saying, well, we don't know, does the law mean that? What does it mean if you've had an occupation that's lasted this long? This long, at that point, was like 20 years or something. And Raja said, well, why don't we ask them? Ask people, we'll ask the internet, we'll ask them. And so they, go around and get these people to come. It was a bit before, it was 20 years, and have this conference. And it's an extraordinary thing to know also that you need to ask for help and to then go ahead, and then that also becomes something. So I know I'm being a little off track here, but I just wanted to salute the people-focused, if you like, the way that everything grew out of groups of people. A small group got a bigger group, a slightly larger group. Now you've got groups across different organizations. I think bearing in mind the momentum and the energy and the creativity and the brilliance that comes from that human endeavor towards a shared goal of justice and dignity is something that we can all hold on to. So I want to thank Al-Haq for that.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in? Shawan, you wanted to come in and say something in response, or does anyone want to ask any questions of the co-panelists? Shawan?
What Lynn said, it's like part of that, it's an emotional things, because you go back also to this long journey. For me, it's an emotional. I was from the young generation at that time at Al-Haq, and these days when I deal with my colleagues, always I said to them, I used to be like you. I encourage you to continue in this way or that way. But, we add but. I would like to share with you today about a few things, just. Today, the librarian, she came to me and she said, there is a new way of dealing with the program of the libraries. Like, for instance, developing a new program called PIP, library or something like that for Google. It will become like a centralized one. And I told her, okay, we have to be ready, to develop also our technology. But let's start. Let's, start thinking about all of these things, and it brings, all the studies about it, what we will benefit from this, who can benefit. Another thing is they came to me and say that we don't want to publish, let me say, and to print a new box. It has to be also to save papers from one side, save space, and we have to think like, e-books or something like that, to publish it online. We can save money, we save space, we save everything. I said, yeah, it's good. Let's also think about it. Today also I met with An-Najah University for the program called Joint Master Program in English, pure in English, about international law. We have been working on this or developing in the last few years, but today they want to start the program jointly with Al-Haq. This is part of the daily life. New ideas, developing new things in the field here, there, that's Al-Haq. The expectation is high. And sometimes when the expectation is high, it becomes as a burden, you know, or also in your shoulders. My colleagues always, every time I said as a director to them, please, we have to have like a time to speak to each other, to have, you know, to develop an ideas. Don't work on a daily basis. Could you please just reduce the activities you put on the plans? They said, okay, yes. They come with a plan more than the other. Why? They feel with the responsibility. This is also an issue, which it means the commitment of the team. Another thing is the new generation. What's missing these days comparing with it before is the international colleagues. Still, the technology solved the problem. Before, when we were, you know, together, dealing, discussing, agree, disagree, this is richer even the life of Al-Haq in all levels. That's today, for instance, what we do is virtual things. Virtual is more than before when it comes to meetings. It takes long time. Keep you, you know, until midnights. That's an issue. Yesterday, for instance, we had a meeting with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to say to her, thank you, and to see where we are in our file. I can't share this, you know, virtually, but that's an issue. On a daily basis, there are things. But what's the main challenge before us today? How to deal with the young generation to maintain hope in their minds. This is one main thing. Another thing is, okay, we expanded our programs, you know, to meet also the needs, the main needs, like business and the human rights, like environment, for instance. This is an issue interrelated to the work of Al-Haq. There are many developments, but in the same time, the same line connecting with all of these stations is the commitment and also the transparency. Always I repeat it, when Al-Haq faced a problem or a crisis, or call it what you want, no one touch one main element is the financial things. The other organization, it was bigger than Al-Haq, became bigger than Al-Haq, with millions of dollars, disappeared for that reasons. Colleagues, you know, they reach the tension between two sides, but no one say any word about, for instance, the transparency of Al-Haq. That's, I think, been told. Because of that, Al-Haq became also more stronger, even than before, and continue in its work. Many, I think, lessons. Even, you know, there are many lessons in other organizations, I'm sure that. Today, for instance, our relations with universities, we try, for instance, to build, which called the center that we did. A few days ago, we finished the annual summer school. I received also comments and feedbacks from professors outside, from judges from Africa. They participated in summer school. From 27 countries over the world, they participated this time. And we decided to have the summer school twice a year because, you know, the people from outside, they ask, and they said, maybe this is the first time we understood the context of Palestine and what's going on there. I think this is one issue. Another thing is the main challenge is how to use also the new techniques, a new technology, even a new way to address also your messages. At the end, you are not media, you are not, but in the same time, things affected your work. How to become more efficient these days. That's also one of the main challenge, the main question before us, how to develop, how to digest things, you know, and continue in your work. The founders of Al-Haq, other colleagues like Lynn, like Emma, like Yost, like others, They still as a models also for Al-Haq generation. Every day they read, they find some materials. The last thing is, a few days ago, I had a discussion with the EU about financial things. I told them, we have the financial records, and I don't mean by records the audit report. I mean by records even the receipts, even handwriting receipt from a grocery or a small shop here or there in this village or that village. We have it since the foundation of Al-Haq, which it means no other organization keep, all of these records, I mean hard copies, saving them since 79 until today. And we would like also to digitalize and keep them, and archiving them, that even each paper. And this is a big and a huge work. It's not easy, but we are doing this. We archived around 80,000 records, 80,000 records, papers, documents here or there in our archiving system. We build it especially for that. And we need maybe more than 300, 400,000 other records. This is a big issue. We look at it as a history of the Palestinian people since late 70s until today. And what's coming next is the affidavits that we took from the people. The affidavits that we have a huge number. I think by itself is a story. I encourage Lisa, for instance, if she can think from her own perspective in new ways, for instance, to come to study these things, telling the stories of the people, what this occupation means. The other thing is today, how we are facing the situation is the division, the internal situation. We don't know if the authority will continue or not. The internal explosion maybe is coming. I don't know. Raja spoke about the other things, about expulsion of the people, but I think also internally speaking, I don't know what will happen. I think we are in a dark moment. We are in the last stage of which called, the transitional time. I have been saying that in the last 3-4 years. I think now we are in the last page and the new things is coming. What's that new things? I don't know what will be shared, but the new generations will take their place. Now pushing them back and not open the door before them, it means some danger things when you read it, because this is the normal things, normal movement. Young generations, they are leading in the street and they are looking to lead also in other places. But the old generation, the others, they are pushing them back and trying to close the door before them. When you close the door before them, you don't know what will happen. We are now in a very critical time. Al-Haq used to deal with the critical times before, but now we are in this critical time. This is an issue also, and this is a challenge before us. Because of that, we start thinking to build, let me say, an analysis and to study some phenomena or trends, social trends, economic trends we haven't studied before. And we call it now, it's like a new way of research. And the new way, we don't mean it to be like the ordinary one we do in legal issues. We are trying to produce, even if it's for internal use, like research about what's going on, how we can study this situation. This is part of the process. Thank you, Lynn, again, and thank you all again. Bishara, I think, by showing the willing and encouraging, Lynn also, you put again the train on the track and give a push to the train. That's great things. but I do believe about the work of Lynn, her professionality, her precise work, detailed research. This is a very important thing, and also the analysis that she added to. Because of that, I offer here again, please, Lynn, if you have an effort, please come and have also a new book about this experience, because many human rights organizations, activists, academics, they will benefit from this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawan. I think before we make any other comments amongst panelists, I'm going to take some questions from the audience, which are coming in the chat. And please put your questions in the chat box, because we do not have the facility of having, allowing you onto the panel. But you all raised some important questions, which we will come back to at the end. And I was taken by the idea of the myth of rights as a Palestinian myself, and that is a challenge to Lisa later on. But one of the questions here, the first one from Wissam Ahmad, says, how important do you think for Al-Haq to push for the evolution of international law, specifically with regard to the prohibition of colonialism as a peremptory norm of general international law? Perhaps to solve the question of Palestine, we have also to eradicate colonialism from the earth and free people of the world. That's quite a big wish. But Raja, did you want to answer that, or anyone else?
I think I leave it to Lisa.
Lisa.
Well, I think that that's a very good question. And of course, the correct answer is yes. But one of the things that I think the implicit lesson we learned from the legacy and the ongoing work of Al-Haq, and as Lynn lays out, is that sometimes it's more important to really tackle the problem than try to find the solution, because if you expose the nature of problems, that tends to have a life of its own. And so even the way that apartheid and colonialism have become the analytical frames for looking at this context, that came about as a result of the precise and detailed methodological work of documenting and monitoring and analyzing things. So, I would say that, understanding the problem is really a great contribution unto itself. And then what comes of it, it puts information out into the world.
Yeah, thank you. That means that there is a call for more exposure and writing about the topic, is how I understand it. There's another question that is particularly important, which is the grassroots human rights activism for the protection of Palestinian rights. Shawan talked about the young generation and what they are doing. So in a sense, how does that relate to the experience of Al-Haq? And what advice would you give to activists from your experience of Al-Haq's journey as a Palestinian human rights organization? And this is a question from Law for Palestine. Sounds interesting. So, Lynn, do you want to talk about this? Bishara?
I'm afraid that I would have to pass this to Shawan. The question is, as a Palestinian human rights activist, I think I'm not qualified. And I think Shawan, you began to speak at the end of your last intervention there about the young generation. So I think really it would be to you to say any advice to young Palestinian human rights activists, many of whom you presumably know, but perhaps also outside Palestine as well as inside Palestine.
Look, I think the hope is coming from the new generation, and the change will come from there. The public and the young generation and the activists is a very important role they play. But we address this question to ourselves. Do we want to be like a grassroots organization, or to stay as professional organizations, but in the same time strengthening and helping, or let me say, cooperating with different groups, universities, others, to give, our human rights perspective, law perspective. And we decided not to go to that direction. But now, for instance, we have like trainings. We try to strengthen in the capacity of different, those that are interested of know more about the international law, the ICC, all of these things. I think even the language, if you follow the language these days of the youngs and the youth, as groups or those they are writing, you feel even the terms, the language of justice, law, human rights, these things. For instance, when we pushed the Palestinian leaders, mainly President Mahmoud Abbas, to accept to go to the ICC, we made the ICC like part of the public opinion and narrative. We used to speak every day. And who pushed Mahmoud Abbas more? I think the young people, when they used to meet with him, mainly from Fatah, they asked him, the first question they used to ask him, why you don't go, for instance, and acceded to the ICC? And he had no answer at that time. This is one main thing that Dr. Saib Erakat said, and maybe Raja, I don't know if he heard that or not, but every time he used to say this. We made it like part of the public opinion. That's the issue. I think youngs, they can make, youth, they can make. Marching in the streets, this is their role, and they can make a difference. What's going on, for instance, in Jerusalem, this is an issue. We document, and we don't want to say that we are accounting the stakes that the people is receiving. But we try to analyze all of these things, and we maintain the hope. We see that, for instance, from the calls. I think it's not a copy that we have to write a copy of Al-Haq and trying to make other models the same. Each one, each side, each group, has their own role to play. But we are now engaging with the young generations through the universities as much as we can. But we try not to politicize Al-Haq. And when I say politicize Al-Haq, taking Al-Haq to, let me say, to any political party to say this is Al-Haq's belong or affiliated with. I think this is one of the main success. It started at the beginning and the first day, and it has to continue. And this is the difference a little bit between us and other organizations in the Arab region. And it was addressed during the 40th of Al-Haq, 40th anniversary, from some of the human rights activists. They said our nature is completely different because we came from, political parties. And we try to deal with the organizations as part of the political party. That, I think, the danger and the risk for any organization like this, to play its role. Our role is to generate, knowledge, addressing what's going on here, give directions, legal directions, and it can be used by anyone. That's the role of Al-Haq, and this is what we are trying to deal with the activists and others.
Is there anyone else who would like to talk about the kind of the human rights or the justice, political justice language that is coming through? Yeah, Bishar, I think you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add to these comments along the three categories that I mentioned before about the significance of Al-Haq, which is one in terms of the political imagination. And I think that is the argument I would link to Lisa's piece. So success without victory really has everything to do with how the political imagination has been reformulated to create a kind of a new way of seeing a new reality along the lines that Shawan just gave examples of. But the other category I mentioned was institution building. And here I want to refer to Joost Hilterman, who wrote a wonderful comment on the chat saying, yeah, it's true, but don't discount what Al-Haq has done in terms of building the infrastructure for a kind of legal judicial system for a state that may not come, or maybe so far off that we can never imagine it coming, but nevertheless, everything that they've done in the last 4 decades or more has really built the basis for legal institutions in the best way possible. The last category I mentioned was knowledge production. And here I want to re-emphasize again how important Lynn's book is and how it fits so well with the New Directions Palestinian Studies series, in that she did not take some theory from Rawlings or some theorist in the West and say, this is a good case study, Al-Haq, of that theory. She has basically built an empirical but also a theoretical framework based on centering the experience of people and events and experiences that are usually never make it, or usually are erased in such studies. By centering the Palestinian experience and making it a platform for rethinking human rights globally, for de-exceptionalizing the Palestinian condition, for thinking about how Al-Haq has really had much larger influence than just on the Palestinian question, I think puts the horse before the cart in a lot of these knowledge production topics. And I'm very glad that we have yet another book that shows how effective and important that is.
Thank you, Bishara. This links to a question by Sami, and I'll go to other questions before it. Does Al-Haq have a strategy to reach people around the world? I can't see a social media presence, and a lot of discussions today through that space to reach the younger generation. So maybe a short answer to that, please, and then we'll go to other questions.
We have no final strategy, but we have a deep discussion these days. But we have been starting since so long, in the last 10 years, to receive which called the summer school and the orientation courses, and received also missions from outside and collaborations with and cooperations with the law clinics in different universities, received students. Because of that, the Israeli groups and lobbyists, for instance, in the US, they wrote to many American universities that Al-Haq is anti-Semitic organization and terrorist organizations. Why you send your students to Al-Haq to receive, for instance, courses, things like that. This has happened 2 years ago. It was a big campaign, and they wrote, to the not to the deans, to the presidents, and to the councils of the universities like New York University, like George Washington University, like Stanford University, things like that. We have this, for instance, we have with the academics in US through organization called PARC. They bring, students. These days we developed a very important thing. For instance, to the youth of the political parties outside in Europe, to have, them, to receive them. Or these days, because everything is virtual and online, we developed which called a live field tours, live. It's not, edited, and it's not recorded, live field tour. You take them for 2 hours, 3 hours, and for them, they can engage with the victims, with the people, directly, and you tell them the story about every space, every place where you go. That's an issue, for instance. It started now with the Netherlands, and the youth in the different political parties in Netherlands, and we want to expand it because it's a virtual, and it allows you, to include others mainly in Europe. This is part of the, it's not just an idea, it's a program now at Al-Haq. It's a project at Al-Haq. Mm-hmm. And we have many things, how to deal with the people. But for instance, after we saw the reaction from the public and from civil society and from people, around the world, I think now the big question is not before Al-Haq only. We started discussing this also internally with the other civil society organization, which strategy that we have to take to strengthen the relations between here, Palestine, and the people outside everywhere.
Thank you. There is a related response here from Frances Hasso. She says, congratulations. I look forward to reading the book to get it.
Oh, hello, Frances. Hello, Frances.
Yeah, and she said, if you remember her,
Yes, hello,
I
Francis.
remember her
and
very well.
towards the end, she says that she was detained on the coast taking a trip via Cyprus with hundreds of Al-Haq Arabic affidavits.
Affidavits, yes.
Palestinians killed by Mustaribin that I was taking to Amman. Although I kept them because I kept saying, well, these people are dead. Working with Al-Haq radicalized me even further, if that was possible. So you do remember her, which is really nice. Another question from Shireen says, thank you for the great work. Is the book going to be available in Arabic? And whether it is available for Palestinian students who come from impoverished backgrounds and maybe others. Coast-free.
I can answer the first bit, and maybe Bishara wants to add. It's already on the site. It's free to download across the world. No one has to pay anything for it except your fees, your Wi-Fi fees, or your whatever your service provider charges you. It's free. The Arabic rights, Shawan and Bishara, Bishara knows this, I've kept the Arabic translation rights for myself. So Al-Haq is free to have them if at any point you want to produce an Arabic translation, for which I'm not volunteering.
Okay, that answers the
so
question.
Hopefully there will be, but we'll have to, maybe, unless Shawan wants to pass it to somebody else, but that's hopefully secured.
Yeah, I think it's very important that the book come out in Arabic, and we discussed this, and I really hope that this can happen sooner rather than later. Several people have asked, how can we get the book, or how can we access the book? So let's repeat once again that New Directions in Palestinian Studies book series, of which this is part, is online, open access, free for all. You can download the book right now and have it for free. And the link has been provided very kindly by Aki, and he can provide it again. I encourage you all to not just download this book, but the other books in this series that are for free for everyone across the world.
Regarding the translation, I will come in a few days. I will not exceed 1 week with a clear answer about these things, and I hope to have like a date. And it's not a confidential thing to say that Lynn, she speaks fluent Arabic. She reads Arabic, and she used to go through, handwriting things to read. Because of that, I think it helped her in this also research and literature, because she used to depend on herself, not on others, for instance, to translate her to her this or that. This is an issue. She can translate it, but we will not put that on her responsibility. We will take this responsibility as Al-Haq. Thank you.
Thanks, Shawan.
Thanks,
But
Shawan.
she will edit it in Arabic.
I don't mind editing it.
Yeah. There's a comment from Just Hitlerman or Hillerman.
Hilterman.
Apologies for the misspelling. I can hardly read. Thank you all. I would just like to add one dimension of the ones mentioned above in relation to the narrative about Rwanda occupation. Lynn alluded to it, but Al-Haq was also part of Palestinian state building. I mean this in a non-political sense, without political objectives or affiliations. Any functioning democracy needs an independent judiciary and independent oversight mechanism. While Al-Haq was contesting a military occupation, it was also helping to build its alternative, an independent state with its trappings. That state may be far off, but the process itself and the institutions it generates is immensely significant. I guess that is a comment rather than a question.
I think it's a comment, but I think it's also something that was there. It became increasingly, I think it's chapter 4. Sorry, I can't remember. It became increasingly evident as al-Haq, well, first of all, it became more confident in its ability to sustain itself on the front of, hostility from the occupation authorities and its increasing profile. But probably Raja is better placed to speak to this. I think that what I started to say about human rights in Palestinian society and the idea of the rule of law, if you read the early correspondence, it was all about, if there's a Palestinian state, that's what I mean by law as future. What do we want it to look like? It was so much part of this and resisting the occupation, but there was always that angle, quite unusually, I think, but I don't know, perhaps Raja would like to say something about that?
Yeah.
Let me unmute. Yes, you're absolutely right. This was always in the front of our mind, that if we want a Palestinian state, then we have to be instrumental in building it, and we are building it through making people aware of the rule of law and of the importance of law and independence of the judiciary and all of that. And we did a lot of studies on all these aspects. Unfortunately, there's no Palestinian state yet.
Okay, thanks, Raja. Question from Lina. Marhaba, Lina. Thank you for a very interesting panel. I wish to ask if there is an activity for Al-Haq in Bethlehem, yes or no? Is there an Jawan? Do you have?
We have a field worker there, and we have activities most of the time, like for instance, taking the groups around Beit Lahem, to show the people what's going on near Walaja and what's going on near Nahalin, Hussan, and other places.
Okay. I think I thought that Bishara was typing an answer because someone was saying, I'm not seeing the answers on question and answers. Example, Just Hilterman's referenced. Perhaps the questions are only visible to the organizers. So I don't know whether there's an answer there that we haven't seen. But there's another question from Muwara. The ongoing discussion of legal political strategies is very inspiring, and Al-Haq's work is certainly groundbreaking. I was lucky to have participated in it, and it was extremely interested, etc. So that is just a comment. But I think there was an interesting question around from Just again. Thank you all. I would just add one dimension.
Welcome back. We are here looking at the cryptocurrency market, and this is going to be my daily forecast for Wednesday, June 16, 2021. If you like supporting the channel, you're welcome to hit the subscribe button down in the corner, hit the like button, the bell button to see our news videos. I will start by looking at Bitcoin. As you can see, we're getting very overstretched here in the top of the Bollinger Band. We pulled back yesterday, pulling back the same for today, but we're approaching the 200 moving average. And the question is whether or not we are going to see a massive rejection as we saw back here when we get to the 200 moving average. 50 moving average is moving this way, 200 moving average moving that way. We'll probably have a crossing of the 50 and the 200, and usually that is a very bearish sign. So we'll see. Otherwise, technical indicators are very bullish. MACD is bullish, stochastic is bullish, CCI is bullish, and so is the RSI. Well, there's a lot of room to the upside. Break above the 200 and the 50, well, then we could see this start trending back towards the 60 and beyond. Break below would get rejected here, then we could also drop back to 30,000. So let's look at Ethereum. So Ethereum got rejected at the 20 exponential. So we tried to rally above it and it got rejected there. Technical indicators are fairly mixed. MACD is flat in negative territory. Stochastic is bullish, CCI is bearish, and the RSI is flat as well. If we get rejected here, then we could drop back to the bottom of the bullish band, which is at 22 and 58. And if that breaks, then we could drop back towards the 200 moving average at 1800, give or take. Break above the 20, then we have the 50 that will target roughly 3000 or 2900, 3000 area. So let's look at Cardano. So Cardano also got rejected at the 50 and the 20 exponential. It looks very similar to Ethereum. Rollover from here, we could see this pull back towards 1.35. If that breaks, then we are heading back towards 1 or the 200 moving average down here at 0.93. Break above here, then we could go and test the previous highs or at the top of the Bollinger Band, which is at 1.79. Technical indicators, we can see that MACD is bearish, the stochastic is bullish, CCI is bearish, and the RSI is flat at this current stage, or a little bit bullish. So let's look at Litecoin. So nothing is really happening here, but we have seen periods in the past where it just went sideways, built momentum, for example here, before rallying. Built momentum, rallied, built momentum and rallied, and so on. So whether or not this is one of those building momentums before rallying, that is to be seen. Or if we just get rejected here at 20 and the 200, or if Bitcoin starts dropping in then again, then we could basically see a massive sell-off in Litecoin. If we drop below these candlesticks here, then we can see this dropping back to 116 or 100. If we rally above the 200, then we have the 50 moving average at 232, and then beyond that. Technical indicators, they are turning around. MACD is bullish, stochastic is bullish, CCI is becoming bullish as well, and the RSI is flat. So let's look at NEO. So NEO, very similar. We are still trading above the 200 moving average, underneath the 20 exponential, or basically middle of those moving averages. If we break below the 200, then we can see this dropping back towards 25 and 20. If we rally above the 20, we could go and head towards 50 at 74, sorry. But it looks like we're going to have a crossing of the 200 and the 20 exponential. So whether or not we break down or up from that point, that is to be seen. Technical indicators are favoring the upside at this point. MACD is bullish, stochastic is bullish, CCI is still bearish territory, but it's turning around, and the RSI is flat. So let's look at Dash. So Dash is very similar to Litecoin. It is struggling to break above the 20 and the 200 moving average in order to get towards the 50. So if you get rejected here, this could drop back towards these previous lows at 120 and the 100. Technical indicators, they are fairly bullish at this point. MACD is bullish, the stochastic is bullish, and the CCI is bearish, and the RSI is flat. So very similar to basically to Litecoin. It's kind of that same graph. But a crossing of the 50 and the 200 moving average, that could spell massive warnings for the long-term trend for most of these cryptocurrencies. So let's look at Dogecoin. So yes, struggling to get anywhere at this point. The hype that basically drove this cryptocurrency to these very highs here, that is fading. And without that hype, well, it doesn't seem like that this has the momentum in order to get back to these previous highs here. So I expect the tweet from Elon Musk about Dogecoin, as he has kind of dropped that at this point. So if we manage to break below, give or take 0.21, then we could drop towards the 200 moving average at 0.1416. If we break above the 50, then we could see 0.50, and then if we break these candles here, then we could go back to the all highs. But that is looking like a tall ask at this point. If Bitcoin starts rallying significantly, then we could see movements here. Otherwise, this looks like it is drifting back towards the 200 moving average. Technical indicators are looking fairly dreadful at this current stage. So, hope you find this helpful. You're welcome to support the channel by subscribing, hit the like button, the bell button to see our newest videos. Good luck, and thank you very much.